know exactly where I got the idea from. Others, I don't necessarily know. And The Initial Insult, which is my newest book, is one of those that I don't necessarily have a really hard and fast memory of getting the story. I think it comes from a bunch of different moments in my life, starting with, oh no, I hope you're going to work. Will you work? Yes, you will work. Starting with my freshman English class. So this would have been about 1993, 1994. And I was in my freshman English class. And we were reading The Cask of Amontillado, which of course ends up being assigned for many, many freshman English classes. And I feel like a lot of people don't understand how kind of outrageous that is. I mean, it's wonderful and I'm so thrilled. But I had the experience being about 14, 15 years old, sitting there in my freshman English class, reading Cask of Amontillado. And of course, we were doing a classroom read. I read very fast. And I had read ahead. I had finished reading the story. And I was just like, what? Oh my God. And there was this illustration. You can see it. I'm sharing it on my screen now. This is Harry Clark is the illustrator, and he illustrated the 1919 collection of Poe's Tales of Mystery and Imagination. And he did these really astounding ink line drawings. And I read The Cask of Amontillado, and I was just sitting there dumbstruck in my freshman English class going, you can do that? You can do that in fiction? At that point in my life, all of the things that I had read, especially for class and in classes, they had been wholesome and they had been positive and there was a lesson. And then all of a sudden we had someone just walling someone up in a wall alive because they're angry at them because they might have insulted them. And so they're just like, okay, I'm done with you. I'm going to wall you up. So I had that experience of having read the story and just being shocked, like, holy moly, and looking at this picture that Harry Clark drew and just being intensely bothered by it, if I'm being honest with you. And the class was still reading together Cask of Amontillado, and I turned the page and I read Poe's short story called Hop Frog, which is even worse. And I was just like, my mind was blown. My mind was completely blown. I was 14 years old, and all of a sudden I found out that you can do that in stories. Yes, you can bury people alive in stories, and Poe actually does it pretty often. This is another Harry Clark illustration. This one is from The Premature Burial, with the title kind of explains it all. But Poe actually really enjoyed burying people alive. It was a big hang up for him. So again, you can see Harry Clark's illustration, which just gives me actual goosebumps every time I look at it. Mostly if you look closely at the facial expression of the dude that's down there, coming awake, coming into consciousness, realizing what has happened to him and being underneath the earth. And you're seeing these other skeletons that have decomposed around him. And for some reason, the look on his face, that realization moment, it terrifies the absolute crap out of me. So Harry Clark's illustration went a long way into grabbing. You can bury people alive. I was a kid who was very interested in dark stories. All of my thoughts, everything that I thought about whenever I thought about writing that were in my head, and there were a lot, I was a daydreamer. They were pretty dark, and I also wasn't ever sharing them because I felt like there was something wrong with me. I was doing something wrong by having these ideas. And all of a sudden I read Poe and I find out, yes, you can bury people alive. Poe did it a lot. He does it in The Fall of the House of Usher. He buries someone alive in The Cask of Amontillado. He walls Montresor up, or Fortunato up in a wine cellar. The Premature Burial, Berenice, and The Black Cat are all stories where Poe makes great use of burying someone alive. He must have had some sort of major hang-up because it was a big thing for him, burying people alive. But Poe also set people on fire, fed them to their pets, stuffed them up chimneys, dismembered and dispersed them, which was a really common, a lot of dismembering. He killed people by having them inhale fumes from a poisonous candle, which I thought was pretty creative. You can also give razors to monkeys and let them loose and they'll kill people for you. Or you can drug them, dress them up in someone else's clothes, force them to vote multiple times in a local election, and then leave them to die in a ditch. Poe didn't write that, but that's what happened to him. I did a lot of research before I wrote this book, and it was about one of the things that I read a lot about was Poe himself. And we have a lot of kind of legends about Poe that have been passed down, and you can make Poe sound really bad without trying too hard. He was an alcoholic. He died in a ditch, frozen to death in the winter because he was passed out. He was, and this is true. However, the real story of Poe is that he was someone who, he didn't necessarily follow what we think of an alcoholic today. He didn't actually drink often or every day or even a lot. Poe had zero tolerance for alcohol. So if he had one drink, it was the equivalent of someone else having 5 or 6. And Poe would become like belligerent and like angry. And he would always just like speak the truth when he had had a drink, and it only took one and he was just gone. And he was writing dark stuff. He was writing stuff that wasn't easily digestible for the general public, but he was very, very talented, and he knew it. He knew that he was a good writer, but his stuff wasn't wildly popular like some of his compatriots and authors at the time, because it was alarming and it was upsetting and people weren't really embracing it. Yet he knew that he was very talented. And he struggled, and he never really had a lot of money, and wasn't able to make like a great living off of his writing, and other people were doing better. And he would get really angry about this. And some of his friends, and also some of the people that didn't like necessarily like him that much, sometimes would think it was funny to give him a drink, and he would get belligerent, and he would kind of go off and start talking about other writers and bad mouthing them and saying like pretty offensive things because he'd had one drink. And then it would make the newspapers. You know, Edgar Allan Poe said this about that person, and Edgar Allan Poe is an alcoholic jerk. And so a lot of the stories that we get about Poe come from some of his behaviors that they weren't necessarily pranks, but sometimes people would encourage him just because it was funny to get Edgar Allan Poe drunk. And so the way that he died, he did in fact die drunk in a ditch, wearing other people's clothes. The reason why is because they were having local elections, and there was no real way to keep track of who was voting. And so there were people that would work for candidates, and they would go out in the streets and they would give people like money for a drink, or just give them a drink and be like, hey, go vote in the election, we'll give you a drink. And then that person would come back to collect their drink or their money or whatever they were being given, and they would switch their clothes. They would put a different coat on them or a different hat, and they'd be like, all right, go vote again, and you can have another drink. And Edgar Allan Poe got like caught up in this, in a cycle, and they don't know how much he had to drink. They don't know if the drinks might have been laced with something. But he ended up, they don't know how many times he voted, how many drinks that he had. But the true story of how he ended up dead in a ditch was because he got pulled into this really unethical voting violations thing, and people just kept getting him drunk and sending him in to vote for their candidate until he died. So that's how Edgar Allan Poe died. And you'll see later on, I actually used some of Poe's story and Poe's life in illuminating one of my characters. So Poe showed me as a young reader who really wanted to be a writer that you can get away with a lot. You can get away with a lot if you know what you're doing. So with all that in mind, actually you can't set people on fire in real life. It's just in fiction. Sorry, guys. You can't set people on fire. You can't wall them up with bricks. You can't poison them with a candle, and you can't put a monkey loose on them with a razor blade. It is still illegal. All right. But you can do it in fiction, and you can do it in YA. And that's something that happens to me a lot as an author that writes for teenagers. I'll have someone ask me, someone that's not familiar with my work will say, you know, what do you write? I say, I write for teenagers. And I'll explain some of my books. All of them are dark. All of them are quite dark. And I have a lot of people who will read my books and walk away fairly shocked at some of the content that is in them. But I think that it's a good thing. I, as a young person growing up in the 80s and the early 90s, I didn't have any really books that were appropriate to my age reading level, yet age content. I was reading at a really high level, but all of the books that were available to me were fairly childish. So for example, with very few exceptions, the exceptions being Lois Duncan, Christopher Pike, and a couple of Judy Blume novels, for the most part, all the books that were available to me that were written for my age range had a plot that went something like, I really want to have a dog, but I can't have a dog because my mom's allergic to dogs. And I was on my way home from school and I found a puppy and I took it home and I'm hiding it in the basement. And I really hope mom doesn't find out. And that was the whole plot, right? So I went from reading that to Cujo, where the dog is going to kill you and probably your mom too, right? So I am so happy that now we can write books for teens that have more content in them that is relatable to them and that they actually want to read. That's a new concept. Okay, so you can get away with it in YA. And I started to really learn this when I was a YA librarian in a high school. And I was like, oh, I didn't know that we could do this now. I didn't know that we were allowed to do these things, right? So all of a sudden, I, who had wanted to be a writer my whole life, but I'd always been writing for the adult market because my ideas were darker and a little scarier. All of a sudden I was like, oh, I can write YA now. Like, that's okay now. So that's what I do. So fast forward, I don't even know how many years, probably like 25. And I'm driving home from work. I substitute now in the same district that I used to be a librarian in. I'm actually teaching 5th grade English on a long term right now. So that's been really fun. But I was driving home from work. So this would have been about 2018. I was driving home from work and a black cat ran in front of my car. So like I said, I don't necessarily remember every single thing that came together that I got the idea for the initial insult, but I do remember this moment. I was driving home and a black cat ran in front of my car. And I was like, oh, and I hit the brakes because I will brake for animals every time. And I missed it and it kept going. And I pulled into the gas station to get some gas. And I was thinking to myself, you know, black cat crossed your path. A lot of people think that's bad luck, but I've always really liked black cats. I always thought they were really cool. And then my brain is just like connecting things. And I'm like, well, you know, Edgar Allan Poe, he wrote that story, The Black Cat, and the cat was not a bad thing. The cat was actually like an arbiter of justice, and it exposed this crime that had occurred. And maybe that black cat is going out there to like go bring some justice to somebody, right? So I was thinking the things like while I pump gas, and then I was like, oh, that's an interesting story idea. And then I was like, oh, you should write that. And so I'm sitting there and I'm like, well, if you're going to use the black cat, like, why don't you use something else? Why don't you take a bunch of different Poe things and put them together? And I'm sitting there and I'm pumping the gas. I'm like, oh, yeah, I could do this and I could do that and I could do this. And I start texting a friend of mine who is also a writer. And I was like, hey, new idea, running it past you. Tell me if it's got legs. And so I say, if I took the black cat, the Cask of Amontillado, the Black Cat, and Mask of the Red Death, and I set them in Appalachia in like Southern Ohio, small town setting, updated. What do you think? And she texts me back and she's like, this is either completely insane or it's a very good idea. And I'm like, all right, I'm going to think about that. So I finish pumping my gas. I drive home. It's about a 7-minute drive. By the time I get home, I had an idea, almost completely coalesced, but not entirely. It does take time. But I had this great idea for what became the initial insult. So first, I took the Cask of Amontillado. And for those of you that have not read the Cask of Amontillado, it's about two adult men who are frenemies. They're out at, I believe it's supposed to be like Mardi Gras. So they are at a big costume party and they've been drinking. And their names are Montresor and Fortunato. And Montresor is kind of psychotic, and he's always felt a little bit lower in esteem than Fortunato. And Fortunato has said so many things to him over years and years of a friendship that maybe felt like put downs and maybe made him angry. And he's just kind of accumulated all these things that have made him angry over years and years. And he's decided that he is going to kill Fortunato by walling him up inside of a wine cellar. So he lures Fortunato down into this wine cellar by promising him this great bottle of wine, this great Amontillado, shackles him to the wall, and just bricks him in all the way. And the whole time, the guy at first thinks it's a joke, and then he realizes it's not, and he's yelling. And it's like, hey, man, you for years, sorry. And he walls them all the way up. So the elements of the cask of Amontillado that I brought into the initial insult are enemies, which are now updated to be, girls in present setting in Southern Ohio, likely very Appalachia setting. Montor is now Tress Montor. Fortunato is Felicity Tornado. And they have a very convoluted history of having been best friends their whole lives up until 5th grade, when Felicity was spending the night at Tress's house. And then all of a sudden, she's like, I have to leave. I have to go. I'm here right now. I need to go home. I need to right now. And Tress, not understanding what has happened, has she done something wrong? Why is the sleepover suddenly falling apart? And Felicity's like, I have to leave right now. I have to go. And Tress's parents drive Felicity home, and they disappear. They are never found. They are gone. Their car is gone. No one knows if they are dead or what has happened to them. Felicity is found lying next to the river, soaking wet, and she's discovered in the morning, and she cannot remember anything. She doesn't know what happened. So fast forward to senior year, they are no longer speaking to each other. Tress has lost her family in a fairly upper class living lifestyle that she had been leading, and she now lives with her grandfather, who I'll talk about more in a minute. But she has basically fallen from no longer benefiting from being an upper middle class girl, and she's been growing up really rough from 5th grade on, and she's got some beefs with Felicity. There's a huge costume party going on. It's Halloween, and they are partying. All the seniors and juniors too are partying at an abandoned house in the middle of nowhere. And Tress, like, I'm going to take advantage of this. I'm going to get Felicity drunk, and I'm going to take her down into the basement of this old abandoned house where there's a coal chute, and I am going to manacle her to the wall, and I'm going to find out what happened to my parents, and I'm going to scare it out of her. She's going to tell me the truth. But I've also got some other things that I want to talk to her about. So every time Tress lays a brick, her frenemy Felicity, up into the wall, she's like, okay, I want you to tell me about my parents. But I also talk about this thing you did in 7th grade. And she's going to lay another brick. And every time she lays a brick, you get the story from 7th grade, 8th grade, whatever happened. You get Tress's point of view, and then you get that same story from Felicity's point of view. And pretty soon you realize that nobody is good and nobody is bad, but one of them is going to die. So that is the elements of the cask of Amontillado that I pulled into the story. I also use elements from the Mask of the Red Death. It's a Halloween costume party. For those of you that are familiar with Mask of the Red Death, it is about end of the world scenario where everyone is dying from an illness, if that sounds familiar. And people are having just huge parties to just kind of, hold back the night, and it's not going well. And there's a whole theme in Mask of the Red Death about time passing and the frailty of youth and of time. And so Mask of the Red Death elements in the initial insert are the Halloween costume party, but also there's a viral flu that has broken out. And in fact, they didn't have school that day because the flu is going around very quickly, very harshly. It's very violent. And so this flu is breaking out. So those are elements of the Red Death. And how much puking is too puking is a really great question, because I really hit the viral flu thing in this book. I actually sent an email to my editor at one point that said, how much puking is too much puking? And he was like, you just go with it and we'll clean it up if we have to. So to move forward with that idea, my mom is a really nice person. My mom is super, super kind. She's really sweet. She has yet to be involved with anything that I've written. She's always a little alarmed, worried that people are going to think that she somehow raised me wrong or caused me trauma. That's simply not true. She's an incredibly kind, wonderful, lovely person. We don't know how this happened. She is not thrilled about all the puking in the book. I heard a lot about puking. I also heard a lot about the language in this book and the violence. Those are all things that my mom had a problem with. I sent her an early copy, and it made her too tense before bed. It was way too much tension in this book. She couldn't handle it before she went to bed. So she's reading Game of Thrones instead. Found that to be a little less traumatizing than the initial insult. I guess it's her daughter wrote it. So she's reading Game of Thrones instead. Repeatedly, every time I give my mother a book that I have written, and she gets an advance copy because my mother, every time I give mother a book that I have written, she says she really wishes that I would just write a nice book about a cat. She just wants me to write a nice book about a cat. That's my mom's goal in life. So I did, kind of. There is a cat in the initial insult. There are actually 3 POVs. There are 3 point of views chapters in initial insult. You get Tress's view, you get Felicity's point of view, and you all chapters from the point of view of a cat. But it's a panther because I'm not going to just make it easy and fun. So the panther comes in from the Black Cat. And if you're familiar with the Black Cat by Edgar Allan Poe, that is an amazing story about a man who murdered his wife. He's pretty much done with her. He murders her. He bricks her body up the cellar because Edgar Allan Poe liked people up. So he broke up inside the cellar, and he also hated her cat, and her cat didn't like him. And after he bricks her up, he's like, oh crap, the cat's gone. And then he's like, oh, well, good riddance to bad rubbish. His cat is gone. So they're looking around, they're wondering what happened to the wife. They are a little suspicious of him. And he's like, no, come on in, look around, I don't know, she's gone. And they go down in the basement, and he's like, here, I'll even show you the basement. She's not down here. She's nowhere. I have no idea what happened. Goes down in the basement, and all of a sudden the cat starts screaming behind the wall. And the cops notice that part of the wall is new and fresh, and they pull on, and the cat has been in the wall with the wife's body, eating it to stay alive, just waiting for the moment when he could let someone know that this crime has been committed. So the Black Cat, which is an amazing short story, I pulled that into the initial insult, also based on something that is somewhat, as soon as I did this locally, I did this presentation locally just on past Saturday. And it was so much fun because where I live, we all grew up together. Everybody knew as soon as I mentioned a white trash zoo, they were immediately like, oh, you mean that one place on this road on that curve? And I'm like, yes. So when I was a teenager, we had what everyone referred to as a white trash zoo. It was basically an irresponsible exotic animal owner who ran a zoo, and it was wild animals in cages and it was a really bad situation. When I was in high school, one of the cats got out. It was a cougar. A cougar got loose, and everybody knew that it was that guy's cougar. But of course he was like, no, it died. I buried it. I don't know. And there was this cougar running around where I live, and it was eating people's pets. And everybody, you weren't allowed to shoot it because it was some type of big cat that was endangered, and you couldn't shoot it. And then it attacked a jogger, and she survived, and she was okay. She wasn't even that badly wounded, but somebody got tired of it, and nobody saw the cougar again. So somebody shot. But I remember so vividly that time period that I worked the Black Cat into this short story. So the Black Cat is a panther. He lives at the White Trash Zoo, which is where Tress has grown up with her grandfather, who is drunk, an irresponsible, fairly cruel man that runs White Trash Zoo. And the night that Tress decides she's going to brick Felicity up in the cellar, the panther flees and it shows up at the party. So there's a party with all these teenagers in Halloween costumes. Everybody's really drunk. There's a murder going on down in the basement. And Tress's cousin, whose name is Ribbit Usher, has had a drink. And he is very much an Edgar Allan Poe character, and he cannot hold the drink. He becomes evil. Ribbit has never been popular, and a lot of the kids are taking advantage of him. And they've put Ribbit like up at the top of this grand staircase, and they've given him one drink. And they keep feeding him drinks after that first one. Realize that he will answer any question at all honestly. He is incapable of lying, and he has no shame when he's been drinking. So they begin playing the worst game of truth or dare in the world with a drunk kid, and they're live streaming it. So this stream starts to get hundreds of thousands, close to 1 million of viewers all across the world. There's a murder going down in the basement. The viral flu is breaking out. People are puking all over the place. And then there's a panther that shows up. So that's what's going on in the initial insult. And when I wrote this in 2018, I was like, how how in the world am I going to pitch this story? Because I wrote it in 2018. And I was like, this is going to be really hard. It's not. All I have to do now, thank you, Netflix, is say that it's Edgar Allan Poe meets the Tiger King with coronavirus, except it's a stomach flu. So I said, like, 2018, I don't even know. People asked me, they were like, you must have written this after Tiger King came out and coronavirus was a thing. And I'm like, nope, I wrote it in 2018. All right, so book 2 will be out in probably February or March of 2022. It is called The Last Laugh. It is heavily based on 3 other Poe short stories, Hop Frog, The Telltale Heart, and Fall of the House of Usher. For those of you that have read the first book, there will again be 3 narrators for the second book, 2 human and 1 animal. The narrators in The Last Laugh will be Tress, her cousin Ribbit, and Rue, the orangutan at the zoo. So that's book 2. That's your sneak peek of book 2. Really quick, I'm going to tell you real quick about my other books. Not a Drop to Drink is my first book. It has a sequel called In a Handful of Dust. Those are post-apocalyptic survival in a world with very little water to drink. It's been compared to The Road, like YA, The Road for YA. It's pretty intense. So that's Not a Drop to Drink. Madness So Discreet. I wrote that book in 2015. It won the Edgar Allan Poe Award that year. It is a gothic historical thriller set in an insane asylum. It deals with the beginnings of criminal profiling, women's rights, and insane asylums and treatments for the insane in the 1890s. The Female of the Species is probably one of my best known books. This is a rape, revenge, vigilante justice story. It's all about a young girl whose older sister is raped and murdered. It happens in a very small town. Everybody knows who did it, but they can't convict the guy because there's not enough physical evidence. He walks. Younger sister's not okay with that, so she kills him. And that's the first chapter. This Darkness Mine is my book that is probably makes the most head spin. So this book is about a real type A girl, never does anything wrong. She's a musician. She's the first chair clarinet in the band. She is the valedictorian. She's got the right boyfriend. She's always doing the right thing. And suddenly her senior year, she starts to want to do quote unquote bad things, and she can't figure out why. She finds an ultrasound of herself from when her mother was pregnant, but there are 2 babies in there and she doesn't have a twin. She doesn't even have a sibling. And she convinces herself that she absorbed her twin in the womb. And of course, she's the good girl. So the twin must have been the evil twin. And she convinces herself she has that twin's heart. And it's starting to make her act out and do these things. The twin and her begin to communicate with each other. She's getting text messages. She's getting emails. She's interacting with this twin. And the question is she right or is she crazy? And you don't know until the very last line, because I actually didn't know until I wrote the very last line. I also have a fantasy series, Given to the Sea and Given to the Earth. These are my longest and most complicated books. These books really took it out of me. Fantasy is the hardest thing to write. And I pitched this as Game of Thrones with no raping, or well, less raping and no dragons. And there's still a plot. I know that might be hard to believe. Okay. Then Be Not Far From Me. This is survival in the Smokies. The best way to pitch this is it's drunk hatchet with a girl. So it's about a senior who goes out to a graduation party out in the middle of nowhere in the Smoky Mountains. And she catches her boyfriend with another girl out in the woods. She gets really upset. She runs away, ends up falling down into a ravine. When they wake up in the morning, her friends all think that she just went home. She's a very accomplished outdoors woman and a hiker, and so they think that she's fine. They leave. She wakes up alone, off trail, with only the clothes on her back and a very bad injury to her foot. And she's out there for about 2 weeks. And it's about her journeying out there. This is the shortest book I've ever written. The main character is alone 98% of the book. And I can tell you that in many ways, while my fantasy series, as I said, it was probably the hardest thing or the most complicated thing I've ever written, and took most out of me in terms of length. Be Not Far From Me is the shortest book I've ever written, and it was the hardest to execute because you don't have dialogue, you don't have interactions, you have one person alone in the woods. It was hard to write. I don't have a slide for my next book because I just put this presentation together and I skipped a book. I have a book called Heroine, Heroine, heroine as in a female hero. It is about the opioid epidemic. It features a female athlete, a softball player. She's injured the winter before her spring season of her senior year of her softball season. She is part of a really small town, but an amazing softball team. And her best friend is the pitcher. And she really needs to be there. If you know anything about pitcher-catcher relationships, it really is a team, a duo. And she needs to be there for her best friend, the pitcher, in order to get needs to D1 colleges to get a full ride. So she's really determined to be there for her best friend. She goes through physical therapy and surgery, many surgeries, and she ends up addicted to her painkillers because they help her get through using oxy, and eventually leads to heroin. And it is just a story of that slow slide down into addiction. That is called Heroine, heroin with an E on the end. And then coming up in November this year, I have a book coming out with James Patterson, which I'm really excited about. It's called City of the Dead. This is part of Maximum Ride series. Maximum Ride has a daughter named Hawk, who is a teenager now. The first book is simply called Hawk. That is out now. City of the Dead is the second book in this series about Hawk. And it's by James Patterson and myself, and it will be out November 29th of this. So that was super exciting for me. That was an awesome experience. You can find online. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm on Instagram. You can see Gus a lot on Instagram. My Dalmatian. MindyMcGinnis.com is email, and then MindyMcGinnis.com is my place online. So that's all my social media stuff. I am going to stop sharing my screen and